of this image. This image, titled "A Goldfish with Suitcases," is one out of over 3,500 3D rendered images published and sold by Fabio Berti, an Italian artist who's worked with CGI since its infancy in the mid to late 80s. His work, spanning finance, health, environmentalism, geopolitics, technology, and love, all having this surreal quality to them, even among his competitors. Berti taking currencies, organs, devices, and foods and rendering them in this surreal digitized style, welding onto them these cartoonish plastic limbs. You see pale sneaker-wearing brains marching down winding, impossible roads. You meet with unblinking eyes peering out of coffee cups. You walk in on a boardroom of medications discussing the rise of something. This is the world of Fabio Berti, where the reality we know is disassembled and repackaged to us in a bleached white hollow computerscape. And after spending the last 3 months of my life digging through thousands of 3D stock images, I can tell you with certainty that Fabio Berti's are my favorites. There's just something so deeply unsettling yet weirdly comforting about this all, and I wouldn't put it past Berti to have leaned into this intentionally. His personal website, listing not just his 40-year history in computer graphics at a very high, actually nationally respected and award-winning professional level, but also displaying his works in other art forms, from traditional painting and photography to logos, advertisements, and web designing to everything in between, all still infused with the same surrealist experimental DNA as his 3D stuff. And as you could imagine, I was very eager to get a peek into the inner workings of this bizarre world, so I sent Fabio an email explaining I was making a video about 3D stock characters and I'd love to ask him a few questions, to which 2 days later, Fabio Berti was happy to answer. Here's what he told me. I started creating stock images in 2009. There's no specific reason why I started. I've always created pencil drawings and illustrations ever since I was a child, and this is probably a way for me to put myself out there, to see if people like my projects and ideas and if they're successful. I asked him how he decides what images to actually make, and he explained, the creative process that leads me to create images stems from concepts or situations I've seen, or maybe even just dreamed about. I don't have a specific workflow. I make sketches on paper or jot down notes about things that catch my interest throughout the day, sometimes while reading the news and newspapers, watching TV, or browsing the internet, and then I develop them on the computer using various 2D and 3D programs without using AI. And I asked him again, as I did with Julian, if there is a calculated system behind his reuse of characters and whether he sees a pattern in what images sell best and so on, and he told me, I don't follow any particular formula. In my opinion, the most beautiful images are the simplest ones, those that stir something in the viewer's soul and perhaps make us feel like children again. There's no need for big special effects. Many of my images feature recurring subjects, most often parts of the human body, to more effectively represent highly metaphorical concepts. I then asked him if the weird, surreal feeling of his images was intentional, and he confirmed, all my images intentionally have a strong surrealist character, stemming from my passion for artists from different eras and nationalities such as René Magritte, Marcel Duchamp, Benito Jacobiti, and Banksy. And penultimately, I asked him to explain the meaning of the goldfish with suitcases image. He told me, this image represents the concept of leaving one's birthplace and the environment where one grew up, one's comfort zone, for a place that one hopes will be better. The doubt remains as to whether one will succeed and be happier. It's a melancholic image that makes you think. But the goldfish will make it, I'm sure of it. I've created several images based on the same concept. This one is perhaps the best. I asked Fabio a 7th and final question after this, but again, I'll save that for later, because it's most clearly in Fabio Berti's 3D work, and like he said, how he tries to effectively represent highly metaphorical concepts, that one of the main mechanics behind the weirdness in this stuff is unveiled, which is that so many of these images are the result of an artist having to make abstract things literal. Think about what a stock image actually has to do. It has to sit at the top of an article or the side of a PowerPoint slide, and in that fraction of a second before the reader's eye moves to the rest of the text, it has to visualize what the surrounding content is saying. It needs to turn something you can read and understand in your mind into something you can see physically with your eyes. But most of the ideas 3D images need to visualize are abstract, since anything real world and literal can be captured perfectly already with an actual photograph. 3D artists are left with what can't really be captured in reality. Ideas like financial risk and security, or the psychology of gambling, or the devaluation of a currency, and so on. Things that don't quite have a natural physical form. So how do you make the invisible visible? You make it literal. For example, the idea of junk food being a danger to your health. How would you 3D model that? Well, you'd break it down into its distinct parts: junk food, danger, and your health. And then you'd find the most easily understood visual representations of those parts. For junk food, maybe a burger or some fries. For danger, well, a lethal weapon would work. Let's use a gun. And for your health, well, the human heart is a universally recognizable symbol of health. And now you're looking at French Fries Dangerous by Fabio Berti, a bizarre image that actually makes total sense. Fabio likely recognized the idea of fast food being a danger to your health, anticipated that people writing articles about the unhealthiness of fast food may want a convenient visual element to quickly communicate that, and so gave the hamburger 2 hands and a loaded pistol, because what could communicate danger faster than the figuratively dangerous thing becoming literally dangerous? A gun, an unmistakable symbol of that. The image fulfills its purpose as a visual helping hand to discussing the dangers of fast food when in context, but on its own, which it never should be, becomes surrealist nonsense. We only ever really see this stuff after it's been ripped far out of its original context, and so it just seems like an ironic, intentionally absurd joke, but it isn't. And of course, not all 3D images are doing this. A lot are just fun, standalone characters vaguely geared towards a given topic, appealing to a broader audience that may just want a fun character to drop into a project for the sake of having a fun character to drop into a project. And some images just seem to exist because somewhere, at some point, someone just wanted it to, and so it does. This is an actual image I found for sale on Shutterstock. Who is this for? But for most images, we are seeing abstract ideas translated into literal ones, and it gets weird. And the 3D-ness is inseparable from this effect. 2D clip art is cartoonish enough that basically anything goes. A hamburger with a gun in 2D is just some angry little burger fella. But 3D rendering is attempting to make a bridge from the overtly fictional to our reality. But without actual photorealism, it can only make an attempt. As within half a second of seeing most 3D modeling, our brain will parse that it isn't real. Everything just looks half real. These images existing in a kind of computer-generated uncanny valley. And since stock imagery doesn't pay that much, and for 3D artists is usually a hobby, side hustle, or something they do as they develop their skills before entering the animation or VFX industry professionally later on, the vast majority of 3D stock images just aren't quite there yet in terms of technical quality. Whether it's a crudely modeled face, a stiff pose, a mismatched texture, or some other rough edge, they can have a kind of honest, homemade charm to them while also looking a bit off, which is only amplified by all these entities existing in a colorless white void. Functionally, this is just to keep the image able to be dropped into any color scheme or composition without clashing, but when looking at these images in isolation, they start to look more like characters extracted from their own reality and placed into a purgatory outside of it. And it isn't just a white background, things in this purgatory do cast shadows, proving they do exist here and are anchored to it as a physical space. And then there's these little featureless people who I couldn't imagine being anywhere but this colorless white void, who seem less like its prisoners and more like its natives, or even its children. And images featuring these little featureless people are a bizarre tradition that almost every 3D artist follows, including Steve Young and Tremor and so many other artists. They're a subgenre within the subgenre of weird 3D that may even outnumber everything we've seen so far. In fact, many artists create only this type of image. I'm talking about the world of bulb-headed humanoids. The internet is crawling with these faceless, simple little PNG people, usually but not always a flat white color with oversized heads. And it just seems to be an unwritten rule that if an artist is producing 3D stock images, they will at some point develop their own mini plasticine person to clone and recycle over and over. And I think the reason for this epidemic is the obvious one. It's because these are the easiest, most effective way to model humans without them becoming distracting. Most of the time, humanoid characters appear as the secondary visual element, meant to complement and draw attention to something else. If they were to have eyes and a mouth and a facial expression and be more, well, human, they'd start to draw attention to themselves, detracting from the instant punch and readability of a good stock image. Add on to that the fact these are simply less time-consuming and difficult to model, and they become an inevitability of the medium. In a similar way to carcinization in nature, the real phenomenon where several separate crustacean species have independently evolved into crabs, the featureless humanoid seems to be an evolutionary perfect form for 3D stock imagery, giving artists the most readable, versatile character model to mass-produce images with. Sometimes they're different colors, sometimes they have different proportions, sometimes they even have eyes and are staring into your soul, but generally I think these are all similar enough to be classified as the same species. And like I said, a huge amount of artists build their entire libraries with them, from Greek artist Konstantinos Kokkinis with his 1,000 plus little computer-bound people busying around in mock corporate settings and hauling 3D text around construction sites, to probably the undisputed heavyweight champion of the subgenre, 3D Man, with his titular 3D men dancing around with photorealistic animals or just interacting with generic symbols and icons and things in the most stock images possible, to even Scott Maxwell with his over 56,000 image library of these shiny, metallic, slender, sphere-headed, noodle-limbed humanoids, all rendered in this surreal, futuristic, perfect aesthetic, which I can only describe as digital feeling, like these people live inside wires and cables and Wi-Fi signals. The company Presenter Media has also become a factory for clip art like this, even adapting a lot of their images into animated GIFs, which provide a fascinating look into what these micro men actually look like, getting into all these bizarre configurations outside of the single frame we usually see. Which makes sense because, as you may know from another video of mine, Presenter Media was founded by the original creative team behind Animation Factory, the company behind thousands of legendary GIFs from the late 90s, early 2000s. GIFs like Frog on Unicycle, Pirate dancing to boombox, nicotine-addicted heart, and so on. Even the old gods of the 3D clip art world have recognized the peak performance of the tiny, bulb-headed humanoid, and despite these being almost objectively the most corporate and soulless 3D stock characters possible, they still manage to retain a distinct human charm. In fact, they're probably the most widely circulated and ironically memed stock characters. Their simplicity and undefinedness not just making their contrast when on the back of a realistic pigeon even more bizarre, but also meaning anyone can identify with and use them, since they are so featureless and so nondescript they just read as person, and so function as the ultimate blank slate avatars to glue any idea together with. And I'm so glad we got a solid few decades where stuff like this was our standard go-to answer for needing ready-to-use visuals for a project, because now Remember those final questions I asked Julian and Fabio? Well, in Fabio's initial reply to me reaching out to him, he mentioned that he was abandoning stock imagery, which has now reached its end. I asked him what he meant by this, and, well, I'll let him speak for himself. In my opinion, the microstock market is now over. There are very few serious agencies left, along with the creators who have helped this sector grow over the past 15 years. The main reason is the policies agencies have implemented regarding royalties paid to creators, which have become increasingly meager. AI has also recently contributed to bringing the market to a near complete halt, even forcing several agencies that had been active for many years to close. The remaining agencies use the images in their catalogs to train their AI, thereby making life almost impossible for creators. And it's true. The average revenue from a stock image is the lowest it's ever been, and steadily decreasing as platforms bloat out with even more images, basically all of which are AI generated. And this is all because generative AI has emerged and handed the buyers of stock imagery, the article writers and web page designers and PowerPoint presenters, the people putting together things nobody is really supposed to critique artistically, an ultra shortcut. Not something interesting or appealing, just something functional, generated in seconds for almost nothing, on demand. I asked Julian about this too, and he put it bluntly. Look, with AI, we're all dying right now. Why would someone pay for stock when they can generate for free with AI? It's both sad and at the same time, that's the way it is. And like Fabio said, Shutterstock, facing these declining image sales, found a new revenue stream, selling out its entire library of images to AI companies as training data, out to the usual soul vacuums like Meta, Amazon, Google, and OpenAI, and the artists whose images are used to receive a 20% cut of whatever Shutterstock earns from them, though there's no transparency into these deals. To put that plainly, the platform is selling the work of its contributors to train the technology that is killing the work of its contributors, and calling it a contributor fund. So why care? Why care that this pointless little car key offering you a glass of beer is losing its little place in the world? Well, it's because these represent more than just efficient visual communication or filling holes in articles or anything one-dimensional enough for a giant mashing, regurgitating algorithm to replicate. They represent us. They're uniquely human, and sure, all art is, but these are not required to be artistic. These are not required to be charming or to have character. These are literally stock images. They're just meant to be easily accessible tools to make an idea visible as quickly as possible. Yet still, they're so personalized. They ooze charm. They have personality. They were made by real human people with their own real human stories, and you can tell. None of these artists sat down intending to make something profound or memorable with these images. They were just intending to make something sellable, to appeal to a possible customer. But in that process, and in having fun and experimenting along the way, knowingly or unknowingly, they couldn't help but let their humanity bleed through. Couldn't help but articulate these original man-made experiences with their own original man-made quirks and bumps and bruises and oddities, and in the end, did make something profound and memorable in a happy accident kind of way. How human.